From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, of which the Young Readers Center is a part, even though we say the Young Readers Center, as does the Center for the Book, belongs to the whole library. And one of our jobs is to promote books and reading and literacy in libraries. And since the Young Readers Center opened in 2009, we can say that we are now doing this for everybody, people of all ages. And the Library of Congress itself is a wonderful institution, but it's 18 to 20 reading rooms, as you probably know, have traditionally, since the late 19th century, have been open for 16 or older. And after, in a period when I came, for a while it went up to 18 and older, then came back down to 16, and now we're open to everyone, as Thomas Jefferson would truly appreciate. The Center for the Book itself was created in 1977 by Daniel Borston when he was Librarian of Congress, and he felt it was important for the library to have a place and also, in particular, have programs that reached out to the general audience that promoted books and reading. We weren't even talking about literacy in 1977, believe it or not. Now we say that our goal is to stimulate public interest in books, reading, literacy, and libraries. We have a special literacy awards program, and also to encourage the study of the role of books, reading, and literacy in libraries in our culture. And it's in that sense we're so happy to be able to present Leonard Marcus today. Leonard has, I think many of you know, Leonard is an expert in all phases of the children's book world, and we're very lucky to have him. What we're going to do today is to have a presentation from Leonard, which he has prepared especially for us. But in addition, we will have a question and answer period. And I know some of you have been part of the Lewis Carroll celebration going on at the Library of Congress and have already been up to the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, or where there is a display of the rare books, copies, various editions of Alice. And others of you, I know, participated in this 2-for-1, this double header of a celebration, in part starting with our Young Readers Center. Last Friday, when those of you who weren't able to join us, there was a special dress-up story time featuring Alice in Wonderland. All costumed children were invited and did join in an Alice parade on the first 2 floors of the Thomas Jefferson Building. Inside the Young Readers Center, and I just took Leonard down to see the Young Readers Center. He actually, the last time he came and he gave a talk for the Center for the Book, we were still in construction down there, so it's been a while, but he was impressed with the wonderful family atmosphere and the developments of the Young Readers Center, which is on the ground floor in this building, and if you haven't seen it, I hope you will. And I should say that a special thank you really to the head of the Young Readers Center, Karen Jaffe, who is here, and also to her assistant, Kaheen Mohammed. They really have entered into the spirit of this Lewis Carroll celebration, and in fact, they've pulled their boss into it in many different ways. I have an interest in the history of the Library of Congress, and it was Karen who actually went to an earlier talk that Leonard gave at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia about Alice, and came back excited to remind me of the small connection the Library of Congress had in helping to return the original manuscript of Alice back to the British Library, where it is on display. It happens that last week I was lucky enough to be in London and lucky enough to have a good part of the day at the British Library. And I had a wonderful time looking at their Alice in Wonderland exhibit, which has been up. Many of you have probably seen it, I hope. And to see their special Alice's pop-up gift shop. And also to come back with a copy of what they are selling, which is their new edition of Alice's Adventures Underground, which is the actual facsimile. And the story, and I'm not going into it because we have to get to Leonard fast because we only have between 1 and 2 o'clock to return to the rare book division to see the rest of the display. But here is how the return, it's a long story, but the the manuscript was sold to an American and eventually found its way back to England, and this was when the heirs were short of money. And there's a description of this in this little book that I'll just read, and then I will quickly introduce Leonard. And it's talking about how the manuscript was sold in 1928 to an American, and then it went on, put up for sale at Sotheby's and went to a donor who then died. In 1946, following the death of its American owner, the original Alice manuscript, depicted here with these wonderful illustrations by Lewis Carroll, came up again in auction. Dr. Rosenbach bought it, and this time for $50,000. Initially, it was $28,000. A plan was then hatched, and here's how this plan was described in this book. I know it is, others of us have different versions. It was hatched, however, by the prominent bibliophile Lessing Rosenwald. You were in the Rosenwald room if you were up at the exhibit earlier, who persuaded a group of wealthy benefactors that the famous little book should be returned to its own country as a gesture of thanks for the British people's gallantry in World War II. On 6 November 1948, the Librarian of Congress, Luther Evans at the time, sailed for England on the Queen Elizabeth, taking the manuscript with him and occasionally sleeping with it under his pillow. On 12 November, he presented it to the British Museum as an expression of thanks to a noble people who kept Hitler at bay for a long period single-handed. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who accepted it on behalf of the nation, acclaimed this gesture as an unsullied and innocent act in a distracted and sinful world, a sentiment which would have appealed to the story's creator. Now, Leonard has prepared a special talk, illustrated talk for us today. Those of you who don't know Leonard may know him as an author of many books related to the worlds of children's books. He, in particular, has taken an interest in recent times in illustrations and illustrated children's books, and this is my last way to introduce Leonard. This is the book that really helped us at the Library of Congress. This is called Show Me a Story, Why Picture Books Matter. And why it mattered to us was that we had just created the Young People's Center in 2009. This book was published in 2012. I'd already met Leonard. He was talking about his work with illustrators. And another important project for the Center for the Book is the National Book Festival. And we were just moving in a serious way towards expanding it and towards something that was also new at the time, graphic novels. And one of the wonderful parts of this particular book, which I brought for Leonard to sign, and then I discovered he'd already signed it, was that it has the biographies, and it really helped introduce at least John Cole to the world of children's book illustration in an important way. We're lucky to have Leonard Marcus here today. He's prepared something for us. He'll tell us about it, and join me in welcoming children's book authority and advocate, Leonard Marcus.
Well, good afternoon. It's really an honor to be here and see so many people. Since we're in the Library of Congress, I want to just mention two American associations with the beginnings of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll improvised the story for the three little girls, the daughters of the Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, where he was a teacher. on July 4th, 1862. And he intended to publish the book exactly 3 years later, on the 4th of July in 1865. Actually, a few copies were printed, but then the illustrator, John Tenniel, saw how poorly the reproduction of his line work had been, and he insisted that the printing be scrapped and started over. Carroll and Tenniel and their publisher Macmillan came up with a novel solution. They decided to send the unbound pages from that first printing to America because the Americans wouldn't know the difference between good printing and bad. So one result of that was that Alice was actually published in the US a little bit before it was published here. And the British edition came out not in 1865, but 1866. So we are actually celebrating the 150th anniversary of Alice in the British fashion today. So I'm going to talk about Lewis Carroll as a man, as a thinker, and as someone who was influenced by one of the great countercultural movements of the modern Western world, Romanticism, and as an influencer of another one of those movements, Surrealism. Alice chronologically falls right smack in the middle between those two developments in Western culture. To look at Lewis Carroll, you would never guess that he was any sort of revolutionary. It's hard to imagine him with a beret and a Gaulois cigarette, which is how you would imagine the Surrealists. But in fact, just about everything that he did involved questioning received wisdom. Certainly, as a writer for children, he came up with another way of thinking about childhood and approaching the business of making a story for children than had really been seen before in print. That implied a different understanding of what children were really like. In other realms, he was one of the very first amateur photographers and one of the very best. And by all indications, he was someone who challenged his own father's sense of what it meant to be a religious person. His father was an archdeacon in the Church of England. He trained to be and became a deacon of the church. But unlike his father, he thought that theater was, that the stage was as good a place for truth to be spoken as the pulpit, whereas many of the more orthodox Christians, like his own father, rejected theater out of hand. So he was constantly rethinking what he had been taught, and that, in some ways, is the message of Alice itself. This is a book, very, very well-known book in England, with which the young Lewis Carroll, whose real name, of course, was Charles Dodgson, would have grown up with. It was a book that was meant to guide children to be industrious, hardworking, well-behaved. This is the most famous rhyme from that book. And those of you who aren't familiar with the rhyme but find that it sounds familiar, it's because it's one of the poems that Lewis Carroll parodied in Alice. Bees, of course, are emblematic of industry. Lewis Carroll was the third of 11 children, the oldest son, and he relished the role of older brother while he and his siblings were growing up. He did magic shows for them. He dressed up with a turban. He had a little puppet theater where he was the impresario of shows. And he wrote poems and made funny drawings like the one you're looking at right now to be published, in quotes, in a magazine that only circulated within the family. So he was, in fact, very industrious, but in ways that were very different from the ones that Isaac Watts had advocated. Here is a rhyme from one of those family magazine poems. Let me read it to you. This is not complete, but you'll get the gist. I have a fairy by my side, which says I must not sleep. When once in pain I loudly cried, it said, you must not weep. If, full of mirth, I smile and grin, it says, "You must not laugh." When once I wished to drink some gin, it said, "You must not quaff." And it goes on, and then it ends with a moral, as all good children's books were meant to do. But his moral is, "You mustn't." So he was, as a 13-year-old, which is how old he was when he wrote this, he was already engaged in parody, and in particular, poking fun and taking symbols and people of authority down a notch. He was showing a great deal of independence of mind. And he was urging that on his younger brothers and sisters. He grew up to become an admirer of the poetry of William Blake. And Blake, of course, had a vision of childhood which lifted the child to the level of a spiritual seer. Blake claimed that as a 4-year-old, an angel had appeared to him in the window of the home where he was growing up. He thought that children had a more direct contact with the spiritual realm than adults did. And as the kind of founding figure of Romanticism, he planted that notion that children are closer to essential reality than the adults are, and that adults kind of lose contact with that sort of knowledge by living a conventional life. This is something that Blake said that I think Lewis Carroll could well identify with. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. When Lewis Carroll was a child, he was born in 1832, this is a book that he might well have known. We don't know if he had a copy then, but he owned a copy as an adult, and he gave this particular copy, which is at the Rosenbach Library, to a child friend. Struwelpeter, German book, sort of swept through Europe and North America. It became a very, very well-known children's book in the 1840s. It was a parody of cautionary tales. It was meant to allow the child and the parent to laugh together, rather than for the parent to feel that he was lording it over the child in instructing the child how to behave. This book appeared the following year in England, Edward Lear's A Book of Nonsense, in the same new playful spirit that Lewis Carroll developed even further in Alice 20 years later. And this is the parody of the poem from Isaac Watts. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail and pour the waters of the Nile in every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. Well, nothing very sweet about that. Yeah. And Alice, the character, is always moving away from her good behavior, the sort of Isaac Watts version of herself that you meet at the very beginning of the story, towards someone who's a lot more curious, more daring, not as nice, but more real. The Industrial Revolution was part of the big change that was happening that made the Romantics feel they had to respond. People were living thinking in terms of science and logic, and losing touch with the spiritual or the sense of wonder in life. Wordsworth, of course, wrote about this in this poem. And here, in this very famous poem, he resorted to lyricism in a sort of ecstatic vein, hoping to connect with people, to get them to reconnect themselves with the unseen and the wondrous in life. He thought that poetry could do that. The Surrealists, when they came around 100 years later, would feel that lyricism wasn't enough, and decided they needed shock tactics. And Surrealism really is all about a jolt to the system in order to get people to break out of their conventional way of thinking about things, in order to have us to be put back in contact with the sense of the unknown and the sense of the wondrous. This really is the visual counterpart of Wordsworth's poem. Hans Christian Andersen was another figure we know of by name from this time. And Andersen was writing as a modern man wonder tales, and he was trying to figure out how you could make a place for the wonderful in the literature of the modern age. And so he thought perhaps the way to think about it is that wonder exists, but most of us just don't notice it. And maybe it's just the children who are a little bit more wide-eyed, as Blake had said, who are more likely to notice the little creature living in the flower cup. And maybe it's the child who, being more wide-eyed and honest with himself, is the one who's most likely to see that the emperor has new clothes. And the emperor is naked is not so far from you're nothing but a pack of cards. And in Alice, Lewis Carroll really undermines almost every kind of authority that a child was likely to know. The authority of adults, the authority of judges and jurors, the authority of kings and queens, the authority of logic and language itself as words slip in and out of their conventional meanings. We don't know exactly what Lewis Carroll thought about Charles Darwin, whose Origin of Species appeared 6 years before Alice did in England. But we know that he owned 19 books by or about Darwin. So he must have been interested. And if you think of the fish footman and other characters that he created, and the portmanteau words, which are amalgams of two different words, or of the puns that he used, where one word seems to mean opposite things or unrelated things, or the scene where the baby turns into a pig all of a sudden, you see that Lewis Carroll was fascinated by the prospect of transformation in the world and of the transient nature of the material world. Lewis Carroll was a devout Christian, and Darwin did nothing to destroy his faith in God. But he nonetheless seems to have been fascinated with this, and at very least thought of natural selection as ripe material for parody and humor. And certainly some of that finds its way into Alice, too. He was also a reader of the new literary genre of fantasy. And George MacDonald was a friend and, in a way, a mentor of his. It was MacDonald and his children who read the Alice manuscript before it was even being considered for publication, and who urged him to think about turning it into a book. And of course, fantasy is also a kind of story which departs from reality as described in biblical terms, but which, in a sense, puts the author in the position of being a sub-creator, a little god who is inventing an alternate universe, which is kind of what Carroll does in Alice. As I mentioned before, he was very open to the theater as another kind of arena of transformation. This was a photograph taken by Lewis Carroll of the most famous stage actress of his day, Ellen Terry, with whom he became a friend. And when Lewis Carroll, years later, had occasion to write about the making of Alice, he described the scene on the river in these terms, as a kind of time of reverie for him and improvisation. Surrealists would look back at this as an indication that Lewis Carroll had tapped into his unconscious, and that he was doing it in the way that they aimed to do as well, to see what would come to the surface without exercising any sort of rational control. Lewis Carroll is sometimes thought of as an oddball recluse, but actually he was a very social being. He frequently took the train from Oxford to London to go to the theater and to visit art galleries and to visit his artist friends. He was close to many of the members of the Pre-Raphaelite painters group and was very familiar with their work. This is a painting that we know that he admired, and it's a painting about a family who are listening to music and being transported to a kind of dreamlike state. So it's very much in line with the quote I just showed you of how Lewis Carroll said that he had come to making up the story about Alice in the first place. This is another painting that we know that he liked very much. The girl there at first glance might seem to be the embodiment of innocence, but at second glance she clearly has something on her mind. This is a thoughtful, wide-eyed, deeply aware person. And this image of childhood is the one that interested Lewis Carroll and that he carried over when he made the manuscript that John was talking about a moment ago, Alice's Adventures Underground, the precursor to the Wonderland book. He had seen this painting just probably weeks or months before he drew this picture. And there is how it looks within the book. Lewis Carroll was a perfectionist, and when he was persuaded to publish the book, he decided that what he had done as a one-off gift to a child friend wasn't good enough. So he set about rewriting and expanding the manuscript and also engaging the best illustrator that he could find. And that was John Tenniel, who was the lead cartoonist for Punch magazine. Now, if you look closely at this image, you'll recognize one of the characters in it to the left of the lion. That is the very first appearance in print of the character that we have come to call Alice, though this image was done before, just about a year before the Alice book was published, and probably before Tenniel knew that this was going to be his representation of the heroine of the story. So it seems that he had a kind of backlog of characters that he could use, and he happened to plug Alice, the Alice one, into this image, which was created for a story about the American Civil War. Notice this is 1864. So there's Tenniel, and this image is a very good representation of his ability to embrace the strangeness of the Wonderland story, but with a sense of humor so that you don't feel that the discordant elements like the frog, which is also part human, are primarily disturbing. They're more funny than otherwise. Whereas one of Tenniel's inspirations, J.J. Granville, French satirist from 20 years earlier, clearly had darker ambitions in terms of the tone that he was trying to set as he called out the animal nature of people of pretense in polite society. And here, flashing forward for a moment, Max Ernst, clearly looking at Granville and probably Tenniel too, used some of the same techniques to disturb and question reality. Lewis Carroll, as I mentioned, was a fine portrait photographer. This is a photograph that he took of Alice a few years before the time of the story. It's a penetrating image and probably one of his very best. And it shows that Carroll was, in a sense, a psychologist, more than a moralist. And in fact, you could say that whereas children's literature up until that time had been about building character, Lewis Carroll was more about developing characters and showing that within a given self, a given individual, there is a kind of rogues gallery of characters all competing to be at the center of the stage. This Alice clearly has a deep emotional life. And I think this photograph, perhaps more than any other that he took, shows that he was a kind of forerunner for the things that Freud would write about just a few decades later. Freud, of course, became a major influence on the Surrealists because Freud was writing and giving names to unconscious states that the Surrealists felt were the part of human experience that most people were not in touch with, were denying. if they even knew they existed. And Freud's interest in dreams became a kind of inspiration for the surrealists to pay more attention to their own dreams and to try to tap into them for artistic purposes. World War I was also an enormously disruptive influence that had a great impact on the artists who became known as the Surrealists, because all the old empires were coming to pieces. And it seemed that it was time for an art that did not aspire to a grand synthesis, but rather one that aimed at breaking people's certainties into bits. That's, I think, the reason that collage became such an important art medium in the years after World War I. And it also gave the Surrealists a kind of roadmap for taking images and putting them together in ways that didn't seem to belong, and for that reason, provoking the kind of puzzled, short-circuited response in people's rational mind that they were really aiming for. This is André Breton, who was kind of the ringleader of the Surrealists and the theoretician. He wrote the two Surrealist manifestos. And this is a very interesting quote because, like Lewis Carroll and like the Romantics, he looked to children as having a better purchase on truth than the adult world did. I'll read this. The mind which plunges into surrealism relives with glowing excitement the best part of childhood. From childhood memories and from a few others, there emanates a feeling of being unintegrated, and then later of having gone astray, which I hold as the most fertile that exists. It is perhaps childhood that comes closest to one's real self. If you think about Alice falling down the rabbit hole, everything that she thinks she knows falls away from her. Her school learning, her good manners, she curtsies as she falls down the hole, but it doesn't do her any good. Language, do cats eat bats or do bats eat cats? Suddenly words untethered to reality become interchangeable. She mentions her cat, her friend, her companion, but where is Dinah? It was that is what Breton means, I think, when he talks about childhood and the lack of things coming together, which in a sense is more real. It's the opposite of putting up arbitrary barriers that make the world seem reasonable, even if at the price of falsifying the reality. So the Surrealists came up with some very interesting ways of jolting people back to that sense of sort of a truthful disconnectedness. We sort of take for granted that words and the images we associate with them are one, but really they aren't. And this painting is meant to make you rethink everything you know about language and the material world and how they relate to each other. And if nothing else, to show that it's an imperfect connection at best. The Surrealists were very expressive about their ideas, and in the 1930s, André Breton listed some of the artists and writers that he considered his precursors, and as you read down the list, you find a somewhat puzzling list, and for various reasons. You find Lewis Carroll among his forebears. The 1930s was a big time for Lewis Carroll's legacy. In 1932, the 100th anniversary of his birth, there were almost no celebrations. It's interesting, people had forgotten about him, more or less. A few years later, an effort was made to change that. The complete works of Lewis Carroll were published in England and then in the US in 1936. And there were major exhibitions in England, France, and the US of surrealism, all of which made some reference to Lewis Carroll as having been an inspiration. This is the poster from the British exhibition. And this is the one from New York's Museum of Modern Art, in which this drawing from Alice's Adventures in Underground was exhibited, and which appears to have influenced Max Ernst, I think, when he came to make drawings inspired by Lewis Carroll a number of years later. Probably the artist who was closest, you might say, to Lewis Carroll, and in some ways the closest to being an illustrator of Lewis Carroll, was René Magritte. And I thought it would be fun to show you how one can actually think of René Magritte as having illustrated Alice, whether or not he was trying to consciously. It would be very surreal of him to have done it unconsciously, in fact. So here's one of my favorite Magritte paintings, and it calls to mind an essay, or actually kind of a math puzzle, mind experiment that Lewis Carroll wrote, having to do with the time zones. And Lewis Carroll was actually partly responsible for the creation of the international dateline, because he began to think about the consequences of having different time zones around the globe, and how at a certain point it becomes yesterday and today in the same place, and how do you make sense of that? And it was creating an arbitrary line like that which became the way for the world to make some sense, some imperfect sense. His essay was called "Where Does the Day Begin?" This is the scene where Alice is growing and growing inside Bill the Lizard's house. It seems very much to have been in the background of this painting by Magritte. And here's the passage. Still she kept on growing, and as a last resource, she put one arm out of the window, one foot up the chimney, and said to herself, "Now I can do no more. Whatever happens, what will become of me?" Here's Alice puzzling over this bottle, wondering whether to believe the tag or not. Think of that painting of Magritte's pipe. It's colored because this comes from a later abridged edition done for younger children, the Nursery Alice. And here again, Magritte is playing games with words and the images associated with them. You know, for the bowler hat, for instance, the caption in French means snow. So he's saying, but in a sense, you know, the words that he chose are just as good as labels for those objects as the ones that we conventionally would apply to them, which is part of his point, the arbitrary nature of the relationship between language and reality. It was very well to say, "Drink me," but the wise little Alice was not going to do that in a hurry. "No, I'll look first," she said, "and see whether it's marked poison or not." Smart child. Here is the caterpillar, the kind of implacable wise man. And here is Magritte looking through you. Who are you? And here is Alice holding a pig that had only moments before been a human baby. And she's puzzling over what happened. This is Escher, not Magritte, but who wasn't really a surrealist, but he was pretty close. The baby grunted again. This time there could be no mistake about it. It was neither more nor less than a pig. She began thinking over other children she knew, who might do very well as pigs, and was just saying to herself, if one only knew the right way to change them. What a wicked sense of humor. Which way? Which way? And here, the famous Mad Tea Party scene. Tea parties being occasions of domesticity, genteel social behavior. And this surrealist object by Meret Oppenheim from the 1930s, where teacup and what goes with it has been transformed into a feral object. Something wild, meant to be shocking and meant to kind of knock you off your pedestal of social certainty. And the Cheshire Cat. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat. It's the most curious thing I ever saw in all my life. A number of the surrealists took a shot at least making one-off paintings inspired directly by Alice. I think they were, by and large, self-consciously eroticized versions of what they kind of perhaps felt superior to when they, to the extent that they looked at it as a children's book. So I think, like this painting, for instance, I just don't find all that convincing. Maybe this one's a little bit better, by Dorothy Tanning. And this by, when René Magritte actually tried to illustrate Alice, I think that's when he didn't quite pull it off. Salvador Dali did his own edition, though, and I've been looking at it lately, and the more I look at it, the more I like it. It's very different from the art by him that we're most familiar with, the hyper-realistic paintings where perspectives are distorted and certain images are called up as compelling symbols, like melting watches, for example. It's much more impressionistic, but the images exist on many levels, and it has almost the quality of a dream image that you are able to peer into. And I think that's what he was probably aiming for. This is the title page. And this woman with the jump rope becomes his Alice, and a kind of motif that reappears everywhere in unexpected places. This is a painting that he would have known and clearly was affected by de Chirico. And here's a painting by Dali in which you see that figure appearing way long before he illustrated Alice. But here is a picture from his book, from I think it was 1969. The more you look in this, the more you see. And it's not just one reality. There are many layers that have been brought together in a way that only dreams can do. And finally, this sculpture from Mexico City, based on the poem parodying Isaac Watts. So thank you very much. So we have time for some questions. We have 10 minutes, if anybody would like to ask one. Or make a comment. Yeah, yes?
I'm interested in your thoughts on the intersection between fantasy and surrealism, because you've shown us a bit of both, but I'm interested in that notion of representation and the idea of fantasy, which I think Carroll was interested in, and this idea of something that's beyond that, maybe tapping into the unconscious mind. I'm just interested in how you see the difference between those two things.
Oh, you're interested in the difference between fantasy and surrealism. Well, I think fantasy, I mean, the surrealists were interested in dreams, and I think they thought of dreams as a productive fantasy that is generated by the human unconscious. So I'm not sure that they would have tried to make a distinction so much as to see dream life as a subset of fantasy, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, the surrealists were interested in operating with as little control over their artistic process as possible. So, I suppose you could make a distinction because, like J.R.R. Tolkien talked about writing fantasy as being a sub-creator, as stepping into the role of a god. So now, as I'm sort of thinking as I speak, and it seems to me that you could make the case that fantasy and surrealism were opposed to each other in that sense. You know, to the extent that the surrealists really wanted to cede control, and that was essential to what they saw as the way to getting at sort of the deepest truth. And that would be the opposite of someone who builds an alternate universe. Yeah.
I had a quick question. Wow, this is quite
I'm not
loud. I'm over
Oh,
here.
you're over here. Okay. Yeah.
About Carroll, I know your focus was on the Surrealists, but you kind of zoomed past the Futurists. And I was curious to hear your thoughts about the connection with playing with the actual depiction of language and words, and any other connections and impressions that with the Futurists.
I don't know as much about the futurists. I mean, I know something, but it sounds like perhaps you would want to say something about that, though.
I've forgotten the technical term for when you depict a language moving, like Lewis Carroll perhaps was one of the first ones to use that in his work.
It's in the way of concrete poetry, where with the image of the tail and the shape of the tail.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that was something that the Futurists enjoyed, and I wondered if there were other types of connections with Carroll and possibly the Futurists.
Offhand, I just don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yes, sir.
There's grown up a kind of subgenre of books, fiction, works of art in all forms about Alice, and I mean, a farrago of tones, and from the innocent to the horrific, especially it seems lately by women authors, and who are fascinated by Alice. And I was wondering why Alice has become such a fertile source of inspiration for these writers and artists.
Well, I mean, I think there's something very basically true about his representation of her. You see in a way, two opposing aspects of a developing human. You see the social self, the one who has learned certain lessons about how to behave among other people at the very beginning. And then she falls down the rabbit hole where it all becomes irrelevant, and she's suddenly put in the position of really any, hero in the classic sense, somebody who's completely on their own in an unknown, uncharted situation. So, I mean, her quest, it is a quest in a way, like Ulysses. It's, there's something there's a core reality to the experience that she goes through, and it's a beautiful way of describing the experience of childhood and growing up and just being human. We talk about growing up. Alice grows up, down, this way, that way, and really her multi-directional fits and starts experience is much truer to what anybody who's being honest with themselves would report as the true nature of living and learning in this world. And I mean, we're always being put upon by people who think they know better than we are, and that happens to Alice all the time. And she has to cope with situations where the consequences are serious and the choices are unclear. Should she drink from that bottle or shouldn't she? People she has been taught to expect good things from turn out not to be helpful or wise or even friendly. So there's so much reality in this apparent nonsense, The nonsense just becomes a way of, in a sense, making it bearable and interesting. It's a deeply realistic book, I think. So, yeah.
As you're talking, that her process really is the process of science, and there's a reason that Martin Gardner, who is a mathematician, did an annotated book. But I wonder if you know, and I haven't looked at that because it didn't connect, but the USA Science and Engineering Festival happens to be meeting in town this weekend. And, with all of the talk about STEM this and STEM that for education, Alice is the perfect embodiment of the scientific process and kind of a mental way into people who immediately tune out when you say the word science. And I'm wondering whether there's been any connection made in that way to try to use Alice, particularly for children?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there's a book called Alice in Numberland, you know, where the mathematical ideas that
But
Lewis,
beyond math,
yeah.
sort of as you're talking about, you know, the fits and starts, that's what research and sort of
Oh, I
discovery
see.
is all about.
I
and
see,
Sort
yeah.
of maintaining the child mind of curiosity.
I see, yeah.
To make discoveries.
Yeah, that's interesting. So much has been written about Alice that I would be willing to bet that someone has written about that. But I mean, he of course was a scientist as well as an artist himself, and so he kind of brought together within him different ideas about truth, you know, measuring truth that were available in his time. Yeah. No, I think you're right. Yeah. I wish I could have been, you know, sat in on one of his math classes. It might have been very interesting. Though he spoke with a stutter, and I have a feeling he didn't feel that comfortable in front of an audience. Yeah.
Lewis, one of the very best descriptions of weightlessness is in Sylvia and Bruno with Lewis Carroll.
Ah, okay. It was just said that in a later book of his called Sylvia and Bruno, Lewis Carroll gave what is described as the best description of weightlessness. Yeah, yeah. I think the best children's books are for everybody. So that's a slightly different, I'm sort of rewriting your question in a sense. We live in a less literary time than he did. The character Alice has studied French at the age of 7, and I think knows a little bit of Latin as well. You know, think how many 7-year-olds you know about whom you could say that. I mean, there would be some, of course, but I think today it's a book that children who are good readers are likely to read at a slightly older age than Victorian children would have. You never know.
Please wait until the microphone gets to you. If you
Oh, all right. The question is Alice really a children's book? And I'm saying that probably young readers today would be older, somewhat older, if you could make a generalization, than the ones who read it when it was new in Victorian England, because of the way culture and education have changed. And also, Americans and British English is not exactly the same thing either. But I also think that it's as much a book for some children as it is a book for some adults.
I would be interested in your comments on Alice's sister, who comforts her when she's back above ground, but dismisses her experience, I think. Do you have any
I never sensed that about it. On what basis do you think that? I mean, what does she say that? I mean, it's true that she's presented as a little bit insensitive at the beginning, in that Alice is bored by the book that she, offers her to look at. But that's not at all surprising. I mean, it just shows you that it's just setting the story up, for Alice to be more on her own and to be to follow her own curiosity and her own impulses, I think. And it's sort of saying, oh, the boring adults, children know more. It's really the romantic view of the child right there. She's reading some boring book. Doesn't have pictures, doesn't have conversations. What good is it?
Do you know anything about the author of Mary Poppins books and whether she was influenced by Lewis Carroll?
Yeah, P.L. Travers.
Yeah.
No doubt, yeah. Alice was enormously popular. And I think everybody who was interested in children's books as a reader, let alone as a writer, would have read it. I mean, P.L. Travers was kind of a mystic. I mean, she was interested in mythology too. So she had other influences. She saw Mary Poppins really as a kind of supernatural goddess figure, and the Disney version is really very different from what she had in mind. So it's, you know, you can't make a kind of a, it's not exactly the same world that she's interested in that Lewis Carroll was interested in, but certainly there was an affinity, I would think. Yeah, sir.
You talked a little bit about the realists and the pre-Raphaelites, and you contrasted that to the surrealists. I'm wondering if you see some similarities either in terms of what the message was that they were trying to convey or the artistic styles.
Well, I mean, the pre-Raphaelites seem to be, maybe they wouldn't have said so, but they seem to have been interested in the dream realm, you know, and the spiritual realm. And, you know, you could certainly say the same thing about some of the surrealists, too. Yeah, yeah, so I think so. I mean, they weren't interested in, the pre-Raphaelites were masters of realistic technique, but they weren't interested in just painting things like, you know, fruit on the table. They were trying to get at some spiritual essence that lay beyond the visible. And to that extent, I mean, the surrealists were trying to catapult people out of the mundane. Yeah. Yes?
Yes. What are your, right here?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's hard to, it's impossible to tell.
Yeah.
Okay.
What are your top 3 most surreal aspects of the Alice book?
Well, one would be, there's sort of like fade-out, fade-ins that connect some of the scenes. You know, the way there's a kind of dream logic to the way the story unfolds. So that would be one of them. It's a little distracting. Surreal. No, yes, I know. I know. I mean, the unreliability of language, which comes up in the form of puns which are misunderstood and which sometimes redirect the action in surprising ways, as with the Queen, you know, threatening to decapitate people, for example. And with all the misunderstandings that arise as a result of that. And I think the fact that Alice is the character who turns out to be the most knowing. And that conforms with what André Breton had said about the ideal state, really, that surrealism was aiming to put its viewers or its audience in, was a state of a sort of a more fractured understanding of the world. I mean, I think the surrealist thought that people had everything much too pat, you know, and he wanted to break it up. They wanted to break it up for them so they would see the fragmentary and inconclusive nature of reality. And Alice, that is Alice's experience more than anybody else's. Everybody else is pretty sure of themselves in that book. So, yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions.
These are good questions, by the way.
They're good.
I feel, yeah.
Let's wait for the microphone.
Oh, yes, over here. Yeah.
I noticed, and I was just curious whether it had occurred to you, that painting that you pointed out of the little girl in bed, you know, with her head cocked and
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
and the shoulder showing.
Yes.
And then the Gypsy Alice, the
Right.
photograph.
Right.
Is that, do you think that influenced him?
Oh, yes.
Because
Oh, yeah.
it's such a lovely parallel there.
Yes, absolutely.
And almost like the way he would see her in his mind's eye.
Right, absolutely. I mean, when Lewis Carroll saw a painting that he liked, and that was the case of the one that I showed with the family listening to music, he brought those people together and photographed them in that pose. I mean, that's how methodical he was and how connected he felt, or moved he felt by certain images. Yeah, so absolutely, yeah.
That came after the photograph. Lewis Carroll took the photograph, and that was the painting that you're referring to was 1864.
Right, well, in that particular example, but in the example I just gave, he photographed it after seeing the painting. So it's, what my point is that this kind of relationship interested him. Right. I mean, it may be coincidental in that case, but on the other hand, there may be other images that predate, which would be just the same.
There is one, the Penelope Ruth painting that he copied as a photo with Isa Bowman.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you. One more, I think. Or have we come to the end?
Oh, there's got to be one more.
Right. Make it a hard one.
Here we go. Here we go, over in the back.
These have been too easy.
Excellent talk,
Thank you.
Leonard.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't really have a question, but just a comment on the lady's question, the lady who was sitting in front of me but has disappeared like the Cheshire Cat. She asked about the mouse's tail and the concrete poetry it represents. There is a technical term for that. It's called technopagnia. Or structured play, if you will, which sums up Carroll in a phrase.
Yes, very good. Thank you. Yeah, great.
Well, please join me in thanking Leonard for a wonderful talk. Leonard, it was really excellent, and it was a talk that stretched you and stretched the audience, I think, a little bit, and just opened up the yet one more layer of the world of Alice and the various manuscripts. You're going to now, there are two places we'd like you to go if you haven't been. One would be upstairs, which I referred to at the beginning. It's in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division in the Rosenwald room, and I'll be happy to lead a group to upstairs to the back if you would. We could just gather in the foyer as we go out. But also, the other place I've mentioned is the Young Readers Center, which is in this building, a completely different direction. You get a chance to follow, Kahid is there, and you can go down a secret staircase that's not quite secret, but nonetheless a little surreal, and visit the Young Readers Center, where there are also, I learned today, copies of books with annotations from the Rare Book and Special Collections Division upstairs. So it's a nice example of pulling out the collections that we have, and you'll see a wonderful array and display of formats and content as well. But thanks for joining us, and another round of applause for Leonard Marcus for a terrific job.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.